Prior to the release of The Last Guardian, many people, including myself, were wondering, would this game be a part of the same world as Team Ico's two previous games, Ico and Shadow of the Colossus? Like I mentioned in my previous video on The Last Guardian, which I will link here, lead designer Fumito Ueda has confirmed that Shadow of the Colossus is a prequel to Ico. Who's to say that The Last Guardian wouldn't fall somewhere on that timeline as well? After The Last Guardian's release, I saw many of my fellow fans lamenting online about how the game doesn't seem to be in the previously established continuity. For a few days, I probably would have joined with that collective lament, because there weren't any obvious clues. But then I realized something. Maybe we were looking too hard. Maybe the answers we sought were staring us right in the face. When I embraced that notion, I crafted a theory, one that helps bring these three games together and helps to explain the universe they inhabit. Like I said in my last video, this is just my interpretation about how these games are linked. If you disagree, fantastic. There's a comment box below, and I'd love to hear your dissent as much as your praise. And in case it wasn't obvious, there are huge spoilers ahead for all three games. I figure it would be easier to point out all the individual similarities these three games share first. After that, I will try to link them via their themes and motifs. The most obvious thing these games share in common is this implied importance over beings that have horns. In each of the three games, we have a horned protagonist. In Ico, we have Ico. In Shadow of the Colossus, we have Demon Wander and Baby Wander. In The Last Guardian, we have Trico. We also have horned antagonists in each of the three games. In Ico, we have the Shadow Children, as well as the guards that captured Ico. In Shadow of the Colossus, we have Dorman. In The Last Guardian, we have the Armored Knights, as well as the rest of the Trico species. The next thing I want to point out are the existence of these shadow creatures in all three games. In Ico, we have the aforementioned Shadow Children, as well as various other shadow beasts. In Shadow of the Colossus, we have the shadowy beings that occupy the Shrine of Worship, as well as Dorman. In The Last Guardian, we have the shadows that animate the Armored Knights. Thirdly, take notice of how the color turquoise manifests itself in each of the three games. In regards to the shadow creatures, almost all of them have turquoise eyes. Even some of the living creatures in the three games have turquoise eyes. Trico's eyes glow turquoise from time to time, and so do the Colossi, and so do the eyes of Demon Wander. We also see a turquoise glow in various weapons throughout the three games. In Ico, we have the Queen's Sword. In Shadow of the Colossus, we have the Ancient Sword, with the ability to shine light. In The Last Guardian, we have the Mirror, which also has the ability to shine light. And besides weapons, we see the turquoise glow appear in various other instances. In Ico, the sarcophagi that the Horned Boys are placed into glows turquoise. In Shadow of the Colossus, the save stones glow turquoise, as well as the cracks in some of the Colossi skin. On top of this, we also see a turquoise glow in the horns and crown of the 12 Colossi. Plus, the tendrils that exit a Colossi's body following their defeat have turquoise-colored edges. And speaking of turquoise-colored edges, notice how the force field that the Queen uses to attack Ico looks somewhat like the force field that the Master of the Valley uses to protect itself. And finally, I'll just list a couple of other similarities that I thought were interesting enough to point out. There is a pool of water with an entranceway in both Shadow of the Colossus's Shrine of Worship and one of the buildings in The Last Guardian. The lizard species that we see in the Forbidden Land seems kind of similar to the species that we see in The Last Guardian's nest. So that is just me listing similarities. Unless I can link these things to an overarching narrative, they could probably be passed off as nothing more than Easter eggs, coincidences, or Team Ico's preference for certain colors. I don't blame anybody who would rather believe there is no connection. For me personally, there are too many similarities between the three games for this to not be intentional. I believe these three games are linked by the three elements we see consistently in each title: horns, shadow creatures, and this emphasis on the dichotomy of darkness and light. The way I see it, these three elements are intrinsic to the practices of an archaic and evil religion. The three games in this series deal with the struggle against those that practice this religion and the witchcraft associated with it. The magic in question involves a powerful entity which has power over the realm of life and death, or rather, light and darkness. Call it Dorman, call it the Master of the Valley, or call it something else. For the sake of clarity, let's just call this evil being the entity, instead of trying to determine whom the supreme being is and who controls whom in this hierarchy of evil. If one knows how to wield the power of the entity, one can be granted the ability to do incredible things, but before wielding it, one must understand how the magic works. The magic in question deals with the properties of the soul, and how the yin-yang of light and darkness binds and penetrates all things. The midway point of light and darkness is the entity's domain, and knowing how to manipulate and maneuver between light and darkness with this midpoint is its power. By giving oneself over to the entity, one can develop some mastery over this midway point, including how to extract the light half from a living being's soul. By sacrificing innocent victims to the entity, the victims come under the entity's control as pure shadow, while those committing the sacrifice are granted the ability to use the extracted light half. Now this light half, I believe, comes in the form of turquoise matter, which we see in the Last Guardian's barrels. We'll get to that more in a moment. To demonstrate my theory most effectively, I think we should start with Ico instead. The horned boys are placed in the sarcophagi that glow turquoise. Soon afterwards, the horned boys become shadow creatures. I believe these sarcophagi are extracting the light half of these horned boys so the queen can prolong her life and not fall completely into the shadow realm. Due to having this mastery over the midway point, she is able to manipulate time and reality. She appears and disappears at will. She can cover her face and uncover her face at will, manipulating the shadows. I suppose the queen was once a prestigious disciple of this evil entity and was eventually awarded control over this midway point. In Shadow of the Colossus, the Shrine of Worship has an altar which I believe was originally used to sacrifice residents of the Forbidden Land to the entity, which, soon afterwards, became Shadow. In exchange, they were granted the use of the light in the form of this turquoise essence. This gave them the ability to craft implements like the ancient sword, as well as the blocks that support the Great Bridge. On top of this, one could take the souls of loved ones committed to the Shadow Realm and combine them with the light, bringing them back to the land of the living. And I believe this is best exemplified with the scene where the ancient sword, forged with the light essence, combined with Wander's shadow half in a pool of water and gave birth to a mortal human being. This might explain why there is also a random pool of water with the same design in The Last Guardian, but like I said, we'll get to that game in a moment. When the former residents of the Forbidden Land realized the barbarity of their practices and were overcome with guilt, they retaliated. They used their ability to manipulate light and darkness by extracting their god's soul and placing it into 16 colossi. This is why there doesn't seem to be any of the light essence in the Forbidden Land, because it had to all be funneled into these giant creatures. Combining the light essence with the land created them. This is exemplified by the turquoise glow we see under some of the colossi's skin. This might also explain the colossi's varying sizes, because it may depend on how much of that essence was available in each part of the Forbidden Land. To further prove my theory, when the colossi are killed, the shadow half overcomes them. The light half shoots like a beam into the sky, and they return to the land from which they were formed. Before that though, the aforementioned midway point representing the entity's soul exits the body in the form of dual-colored tendrils. By having these tendrils penetrate Wander, this allowed for Dorman to use Wander as a vessel to move between his evil realm into the mortal realm as a gigantic demon. As for The Last Guardian, I'm reluctant to say whether or not the Master of the Valley is or isn't Dorman. I think with the evidence presented to us, it just makes sense to say that Dorman and the Master are the products of this universe's version of the Underworld, or Hell. Pushing that aside, the Master is nonetheless related to this religion and the light-dark dichotomy I outlined with the previous two games. Just like with Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, we see an evil being with powers associated with light and shadow. We see shadow minions carrying out the evil one's bidding. We see the use of sacrifice for unnatural means, resulting in costs and benefits for all parties involved. We see individuals and groups rebelling against this religion and forbidding interaction with it. And for those who do engage with this type of magic often, they tend to bear horns. Like I said at the beginning of this video, this is just my interpretation of how these games are linked. Due to the lack of explicit narrative in all three games, there's enough room for interpretation where you could come up with a better theory than my own. Heck, there might not be any truth to my assertions, and The Last Guardian might not at all be in the previously established continuity. Whatever the real truth is, I ask you to at least humor my theory. Even if I'm trying to spin gold from straw, you have to admit, there are enough potential links there to merit at least a small possibility.